Staff Sergeant Michael Torres sat motionless in the defendant's chair, his calloused hands folded on the polished mahogany table before him. The Purple Heart ribbon on his dress uniform caught the harsh fluorescent light of the military courtroom, creating a stark contrast against the severity of the charges being read against him. Judge Harold Bennett peered down from his elevated bench with undisguised contempt, his weathered face twisted into a permanent scowl that had intimidated countless service members over his 20-year career on the military bench. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sergeant Torres, Bennett's voice dripped with disdain as he shuffled through the case files. Abandoning your post during a critical rescue operation is not just cowardice. It's a betrayal of everything this uniform represents. You had one job and you ran like a scared child. The courtroom fell silent except for the steady hum of the air conditioning system. Some soldiers rise to the occasion when lives are on the line. Others reveal their true nature when courage is required. Which are you, Sergeant? What happened next would not only expose the truth behind that fateful night in Prague, but would reveal a secret so classified that even the judge prosecuting the case had no idea what forces he was truly dealing with. The two words Torres whispered into that microphone would send shockwaves through the highest levels of military command and prove that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism happen in shadows where no one can see. The military courthouse at Fort Campbell sprawled across the Kentucky landscape like a fortress of bureaucracy and justice, its red brick facade and towering white columns designed to project authority and permanence. Inside Courtroom 7, the October morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the oak-paneled walls adorned with portraits of distinguished military leaders whose stern faces seemed to watch over the proceedings with silent judgment. The room carried the weight of military tradition, from the precisely arranged flags flanking the judge's bench to the gleaming brass fixtures that reflected the careers and reputations that had been made and broken within these walls. Michael Torres had arrived at the courthouse 2 hours before his scheduled hearing, a habit ingrained through years of military precision that demanded being early was being on time, and being on time was being late. He sat now with the perfect posture of a career soldier, his spine straight and shoulders squared, though those who knew him well might have noticed the slight tension in his jaw, and the way his right thumb traced an unconscious pattern against the burn scar on his neck, a nervous habit he'd developed during the long months of recovery after Prague. The scar itself was barely visible beneath his dress uniform collar, a twisted patch of pale skin that served as a constant reminder of the night that had changed everything. The court-martial proceedings had been underway for 3 days, each session drawing a growing crowd of military personnel and officials whose presence seemed to suggest that Staff Sergeant Michael Torres represented something more significant than a simple case of battlefield cowardice. In the gallery sat officers from various branches of the military, intelligence operatives whose civilian clothes couldn't quite disguise their professional bearing, and a handful of men and women whose hard eyes and watchful postures marked them as operators from the Special Forces community. They observed the proceedings with the focused attention of people who understood that the outcome of this trial would ripple far beyond the fate of one sergeant. Colonel James Harrison commanded the prosecution table with the confidence of a man who had built his career on winning difficult cases and breaking down reluctant defendants. His silver hair was trimmed to regulation length, and his dress uniform displayed an impressive array of ribbons and commendations earned through 2 decades of service in the Judge Advocate General's Corps. Unlike many military lawyers who had spent their careers behind desks, Harrison possessed a sharp intellect and courtroom instincts that had made him one of the most feared prosecutors in the military justice system. He understood the psychology of military discipline, and knew exactly how to frame Torres's actions in terms that would resonate with a panel of career officers. The evidence against Torres appeared overwhelming and damning. Satellite footage displayed on multiple screens throughout the courtroom showed the exterior of a Prague warehouse where Operation Thunderstrike had unfolded 6 months earlier. Thermal imaging revealed the heat signatures of the rescue team as they breached the building where 3 American contractors were being held hostage by a terrorist cell with ties to international arms trafficking. Radio communications provided a clinical soundtrack to the mission, capturing the precise coordination of the assault team as they moved through the building, room by room toward their objective. The recording that would prove most damaging to Torres's defense came at the 7-minute mark of the operation. Command's voice crackled through the speakers with urgent authority. Falcon 2, maintain perimeter security. Do not abandon your position under any circumstances. Torres's response came back steady and clear. Copy command. Falcon 2 holding position. But the thermal imaging showed a different story entirely. At the crucial moment when his teammates needed covering fire to extract the hostages, Torres had simply vanished from his assigned position, leaving his brothers in arms exposed and vulnerable. Captain Sarah Williams sat at the defense table with the resigned expression of a lawyer who knew she was fighting an uphill battle against overwhelming evidence and institutional pressure. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her uniform bore the ribbon.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Of someone who had served with distinction before transitioning to military law. She had volunteered to defend Torres despite warnings from colleagues that the case was unwinnable and would likely damage her own career prospects. Something about the sergeant's quiet dignity and his consistent refusal to offer any explanation for his actions had convinced her that there was more to the story than what appeared in the official reports. Williams had spent weeks trying to access Torres's complete service record, hoping to establish a pattern of exemplary conduct that might provide context for his actions during Operation Thunderstrike. Every request had been denied, blocked by classifications and security protocols that seemed unusually extensive for a sergeant with what appeared to be a standard infantry background. When she pressed Torres for details about his previous deployments, he would only say that some missions were better left forgotten, and that digging too deeply into his past might cause problems for people who didn't deserve them. The prosecution's case relied heavily on testimony from Torres's commanding officer, Major Robert Chen, who had led Operation Thunderstrike from the Tactical Operations Center. Chen described Torres as a reliable soldier who had performed well in previous conventional operations, but noted what he characterized as an alarming pattern of hesitation during high-stress situations. Under Harrison's questioning, Chen painted a picture of a sergeant who had been showing signs of combat stress and whose judgment had become increasingly questionable in the months leading up to Prague. Sergeant Torres had been expressing concerns about intelligence reliability, Chen testified, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being believed without question. He seemed to question orders more frequently, and appeared to be suffering from what I would characterize as decision paralysis when faced with complex tactical situations. In retrospect, I should have recommended him for psychological evaluation before including him in Operation Thunderstrike. The testimony continued with devastating precision, as Chen described the consequences of Torres's abandonment of his post. Without covering fire from his position, the extraction team had been pinned down by enemy fire for precious minutes that allowed the terrorists to execute one of the American hostages before the building could be secured. The other 2 hostages had been rescued, but one bore permanent injuries from the prolonged firefight that might have been prevented if Torres had maintained his position as ordered. Williams rose to cross-examine, but her questions seemed to bounce harmlessly off Chen's composed testimony. When she asked about Torres's previous combat record, Chen acknowledged that it was exemplary but maintained that combat stress could affect even the most experienced soldiers unpredictably. When she pressed for details about the intelligence that had preceded the operation, Harrison's objections were sustained by Judge Bennett, who ruled that operational security concerns took precedence over the defense's fishing expedition. As the 3rd day of testimony drew to a close, Williams found herself facing the uncomfortable reality that she had no effective defense to offer her client. Torres had refused to testify on his own behalf, refused to allow her to present character witnesses from his previous units, and refused to provide any explanation for his actions that might give her leverage in negotiations with the prosecution. He sat through each day of damaging testimony with the same stoic expression, occasionally taking notes but never showing any reaction to even the most inflammatory accusations against his character and courage. The courtroom atmosphere grew increasingly hostile as word of the proceedings spread throughout the military community at Fort Campbell. Senior officers who had no direct connection to the case began appearing in the gallery, their presence serving as a silent reminder that the reputation of the entire special operations community was somehow tied to the outcome of Torres's trial. The message was clear: cowardice and abandonment of duty could not be tolerated, regardless of an individual soldier's previous service record. Judge Bennett had made his opinion of the defendant clear from the beginning of the proceedings. During pretrial motions, he had denied every defense request for expanded discovery, ruled against allowing expert testimony on combat stress, and generally conducted the trial in a manner that seemed designed to reach a swift conviction. His reputation as a hanging judge was well established throughout the military justice system, and many observers expected Torres to receive the maximum possible sentence, as an example to other soldiers who might be tempted to abandon their duties when lives were on the line. The prosecution's final witness was Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a military psychologist who had evaluated Torres during his recovery from injuries sustained during Operation Thunderstrike. Her testimony focused on what she characterized as Torres's inability to process the moral complexities of modern warfare, and his tendency toward paralysis when faced with difficult decisions. She described him as someone who had been overwhelmed by the responsibilities of his position, and had chosen flight over fight, when confronted with a situation that demanded decisive action. Sergeant Torres exhibits classic symptoms of someone who has been exposed to too much combat stress without adequate processing time, Dr. Rodriguez explained to the court. His psychological profile suggests someone who has reached his breaking point and is no longer capable of making the split-second decisions that military operations require. His abandonment of his post was not a conscious act of cowardice, but rather the inevitable result of a mind that could no longer cope with the demands being placed upon it. Williams objected to the characterization, arguing that Torres had never been given a comprehensive psychological evaluation, and that Dr. Rodriguez's conclusions were based on limited interactions during his medical treatment. But Bennett overruled her objections, allowing the testimony to stand as evidence of Torres's unfitness for continued military service. The implication was clear: whether Torres was a coward or simply broken, the result was the same. He could not be trusted to perform his duties when American lives hung in the balance. As the fourth day of proceedings began, the tension in the courtroom had reached a palpable level. Torres sat at the defense table wearing the same composed expression he had maintained throughout the trial, but something had changed in his bearing. Those familiar with reading body language might have noticed the slight shift in his posture, the way his eyes now tracked certain individuals in the gallery with newfound interest, and the subtle tension in his shoulders that suggested a coiled spring waiting to be released. The change had begun the previous evening when Williams had received an unexpected visitor at her quarters. General Patricia Stone, a legend in special operations circles whose very presence commanded respect from the highest levels of military leadership, had appeared at her door without warning or fanfare. The conversation that followed had been brief and cryptic, consisting mainly of Stone advising Williams to ensure that her client was given every opportunity to speak for himself when the time came. Sometimes the truth has been buried so deeply that it takes an earthquake to bring it to the surface, Stone had said before disappearing into the night as mysteriously as she had arrived. Make sure Sergeant Torres knows that there are people who remember what really happened, and who are prepared to honor the sacrifices that have been made in shadows where medals cannot be awarded. Colonel Harrison rose to deliver his closing argument with the confidence of a prosecutor who believed he had presented an airtight case. He methodically reviewed the evidence against Torres, emphasizing the clear chain of events that had led to the death of an American hostage and the endangerment of the rescue team. His voice carried the moral authority of someone speaking for every soldier who had ever faithfully maintained their position under fire, every operator who had chosen duty over personal safety when the stakes were highest. Members of the court, Harrison began, his voice filling the hushed courtroom. The evidence in this case is as clear as it is damning. Sergeant Torres was given a specific mission-critical assignment: maintain perimeter security and provide covering fire for the extraction team. At the moment when his brothers in arms needed him most, he abandoned his post without authorization, without communication, and without regard for the consequences of his actions. Harrison paused to let the weight of his words settle over the courtroom before continuing. The defense has offered no explanation for this abandonment because no explanation exists that could justify such a fundamental breach of military duty. Sergeant Torres was not wounded, he was not under direct fire, he was not responding to changed tactical conditions. He simply left his post at the moment when courage was required, and an American died as a direct result of his cowardice. The prosecutor's closing continued for nearly an hour, methodically destroying any possible sympathy the court might have felt for Torres while building the case for maximum punishment. Harrison painted a picture of a soldier who had cracked under pressure, and whose continued presence in the military represented a danger to every service member who might be forced to rely on him in future operations. He demanded not just conviction, but a sentence severe enough to send a message throughout the military that abandonment of duty would be met with the full force of military justice. Williams rose to present her closing argument, knowing that she had little to work with beyond appeals to Torres's previous service record and requests for mercy based on combat stress. She spoke passionately about the psychological toll of repeated deployments and the unfairness of judging a soldier's entire career based on a single moment of crisis. But her words seemed to echo hollowly in the vast courtroom, lacking the concrete evidence needed to counter the prosecution's overwhelming case. As Williams concluded her remarks and returned to the defense table, Judge Bennett prepared to call for a recess before the court would deliberate on Torres's fate. The outcome seemed inevitable to everyone present. Torres would be convicted, sentenced to military prison, and discharged in disgrace. His military career would end not with the honors that his previous service might have warranted, but with the permanent stain of cowardice and abandonment of duty. But as Bennett raised his gavel to adjourn the proceedings, Torres did something that surprised everyone in the courtroom. For the first time during the entire trial, he stood without being asked and addressed the court directly. "Your Honor," Torres said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to fill the room despite its low volume, "I request permission to make a statement for the record." Bennett looked down at the sergeant with barely concealed irritation. The case was over, the evidence was clear, and he was eager to move on to the sentencing phase where Torres would finally receive the punishment his actions deserved. "Sergeant Torres, you had ample opportunity to testify during the trial. The time for statements has passed," Bennett replied dismissively. But Torres remained standing, his posture now revealing the bearing of someone accustomed to command despite his enlisted rank. Something had shifted in his demeanor, a transformation that was subtle but unmistakable to those trained to recognize it. "With respect, Your Honor, I believe there are facts relevant to this case that have not been presented to the court. Facts that might change the court's understanding of what happened in Prague." Williams looked at her client with surprise and growing hope. Throughout the months of preparation, Torres had consistently refused to discuss the details of Operation Thunderstrike, or to consider testifying on his own behalf. Now, with conviction seeming certain, he was finally ready to speak. Bennett's expression hardened with annoyance. He had built his reputation on running efficient courtrooms where defendants who chose not to participate in their own defense didn't get to change their minds at the last minute when they realized the gravity of their situation. "The time for presenting evidence has concluded, Sergeant. If you had information relevant to your defense, you should have shared it with your attorney months ago." Bennett raised his gavel again, clearly intending to end the proceedings. But Torres remained standing, and something in his posture caused several of the special operations personnel in the gallery to lean forward with sudden attention. They recognized something in the sergeant's bearing that hadn't been visible during the previous days of testimony, a quality that marked him as something more than the broken soldier the prosecution had portrayed. "Your Honor," Torres said, his voice now carrying an edge that commanded attention, "I respectfully request permission to identify myself properly for the record." Bennett's eyes narrowed with growing impatience as he stared down at Torres from his elevated position. The courtroom had fallen into an expectant silence,
with every person present sensing that something significant was about to unfold.
The judge's fingers drummed against the mahogany surface of his bench,
A nervous habit that betrayed his desire to conclude what he considered an open and shut case of military misconduct.
Sergeant Torres,
Your identity has been established for the record multiple times during these proceedings. You are Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, service number 447921835, currently assigned to the 3rd Special Forces Group. This court has no interest in theatrical presentations or last-minute dramatics. Torres remained at attention, but something had fundamentally changed in his bearing. The defeated posture of a soldier facing inevitable conviction had been replaced by the confident stance of someone who possessed information that could alter the entire trajectory of the proceedings. Captain Williams watched her client with growing amazement, recognizing for the first time the man that Torres had kept carefully hidden throughout months of preparation and testimony. Your Honor, with respect, my current assignment to 3rd Special Forces Group represents only a portion of my service record. There are elements of my military background that have not been disclosed to this court due to classification restrictions that I now formally request permission to waive. The statement sent a ripple of murmured conversation through the gallery, where several intelligence operatives and special operations personnel exchanged meaningful glances. General Patricia Stone, who had entered the courtroom quietly during Williams' closing argument, leaned forward with an expression of intense interest. Her presence had gone unnoticed by most observers, but those familiar with the special operations community recognized her immediately as one of the most respected figures in modern military history. Colonel Harrison rose from the prosecution table with evident confusion and growing concern. The confident demeanor he had maintained throughout the trial began to show cracks as he realized that Torres might possess information that could undermine the carefully constructed case against him.
Tide of the proceedings was finally beginning to turn in her client's favor. Your Honor, the defense has repeatedly requested access to Sergeant Torres's complete service record, and has been denied at every turn. If General Stone is prepared to provide information that was previously classified, the defense welcomes the opportunity to present a complete picture of my client's background and the context for his actions. Bennett found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position as the orderly progression of his courtroom was disrupted by forces beyond his control. The presence of General Stone and the implications of classified information suggested that Torres's case involved complexities that extended far beyond the simple charge of abandoning his post. The judge's preference for straightforward cases with clear outcomes was being challenged by circumstances that threatened to expose him to scrutiny from levels of command that he preferred to avoid. The courtroom had become a study in tension as various factions positioned themselves for what was clearly becoming a battle over information and authority. The intelligence operatives in the gallery maintained their watchful silence, but their focused attention on the proceedings suggested that the outcome would have ramifications extending well beyond Torres's individual fate. Several additional senior officers had entered the courtroom during the exchanges, their presence adding weight to the sense that significant interests were at stake. Torres himself remained at attention throughout the increasingly heated exchanges between the legal officers and General Stone. His composure was remarkable given the circumstances, but close observation revealed subtle signs of the internal pressure he was experiencing. The burn scar on his neck seemed more prominent under the harsh courtroom lighting, and his hands showed the slight tremor that often accompanied the decision to break years of operational security and reveal classified information. Rodriguez, the military psychologist who had testified about Torres's supposed combat stress and decision paralysis, watched the proceedings with growing confusion. Her evaluation of Torres had been based on conventional psychological models and standard trauma responses, but the man standing before the court displayed none of the characteristics she had described in her testimony. His bearing and composure suggested someone far more complex and capable than the broken soldier she had portrayed. The turning point came when Bennett made the tactical error of dismissing General Stone's authority in his courtroom. His frustration with the disruption of his orderly proceedings led him to assert his judicial authority in terms that revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of the forces he was dealing with.
General Stone, I appreciate your concern for the defendant, but this court operates under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, not the preferences of Special Operations Command. Sergeant Torres will face the consequences of his actions based on the evidence properly presented to this tribunal. Your attempt to introduce classified information after the close of evidence is inappropriate and will not be permitted. Stone's response was measured but carried an undertone of steel that caused several of the observers to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Her decades of experience in dealing with bureaucratic obstacles had taught her exactly how to apply pressure when conventional channels proved inadequate. Your Honor, I believe there may be some confusion about the scope of this court's authority. The operations in question fall under special access programs that are governed by different classification and disclosure rules than conventional military actions. Sergeant Torres has been operating under those rules throughout these proceedings, which has limited his ability to present a complete defense. The implications of Stone's statement began to register with the more experienced observers in the courtroom. Special access programs represented the most highly classified and compartmentalized operations in the military, involving activities that were often not acknowledged to exist even within the intelligence community. If Torres had been involved in such operations, it would explain not only his silence during the proceedings but also the presence of so many intelligence personnel in the gallery. Williams realized that she was finally beginning to understand the true nature of her client's situation. Torres's refusal to discuss his background, his insistence that some secrets were better left buried, and his apparent acceptance of conviction rather than revealing classified information all made sense in the context of special access programs. He had been protecting not just his own operational security but the safety and security of ongoing missions and personnel whose lives depended on maintaining the secrecy of their activities. Colonel Harrison's confidence began to visibly erode as he recognized that his carefully constructed case might be built on incomplete information. His reputation as a prosecutor depended on thorough preparation and complete understanding of the facts, but the suggestion that Torres had been operating under special access programs meant that crucial context had been deliberately withheld from the proceedings. The prospect of having a high-profile conviction overturned due to the discovery of exculpatory classified information was a career-threatening possibility. Bennett's position became increasingly untenable as the various pressures converged on his courtroom. His desire to maintain judicial authority conflicted with the growing evidence that he was dealing with matters beyond his experience and expertise. The presence of General Stone and the implications of her statements suggested that higher levels of command were taking an interest in the proceedings, creating political pressures that he was ill-equipped to navigate. The tension reached a breaking point when Torres finally spoke again, his voice carrying a quiet authority that commanded attention from everyone present. Your Honor, I have spent 6 months protecting information that I believed was more important than my own career and reputation. I have allowed myself to be characterized as a coward and a failure rather than compromise operational security that could endanger ongoing missions and personnel. But I cannot remain silent while this court renders judgment based on an incomplete understanding of the facts. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as Torres paused, clearly weighing the consequences of what he was about to reveal. General Stone nodded almost imperceptibly, a gesture that seemed to provide him with the authorization he needed to proceed. The operation in Prague was not a simple hostage rescue as it has been characterized to this court. It was a cover operation designed to provide plausible justification for activities that cannot be acknowledged through official channels. My abandonment of my assigned position was not an act of cowardice but the execution of primary mission objectives that took precedence over the cover operation. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom as the implications began to register with the various observers. If Torres was telling the truth, then everything about the prosecution's case was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what had actually occurred in Prague. The apparent hostage rescue had been a deliberate deception designed to mask activities that were so sensitive they could not be officially acknowledged even in a military court. Harrison rose to object but found himself at a loss for words as he realized that his entire case might be undermined by information that had been deliberately concealed from him. The ethical implications were staggering, as was the possibility that he had unknowingly participated in the prosecution of a soldier who had actually been following orders of the highest classification. Bennett's face had gone pale as he grasped the magnitude of the situation developing in his courtroom.
The straightforward case of military misconduct that he had expected to conclude with a routine conviction had transformed into something that threatened to expose him to scrutiny from the highest levels of government. His reputation for efficiency and order was crumbling as forces beyond his control took over the proceedings. General Stone stepped forward again, her presence now dominating the courtroom despite her relatively small stature. The authority she projected seemed to fill the space, making it clear to everyone present that the proceedings had moved beyond the jurisdiction of a simple military court. Your Honor, I formally request a recess to allow for the proper briefing of all parties on the classified aspects of this case. The interests of justice require that this tribunal have access to complete information before rendering judgment on Sergeant Torres's actions. Torres remained standing throughout the chaos that his revelation had created, his bearing now fully revealing the professional operator that he had kept hidden throughout months of legal proceedings. The burned scar on his neck caught the light, a visible reminder of sacrifices made in service to missions that could never be publicly acknowledged or honored. The courtroom had become a battlefield where different levels of authority and competing interests struggled for control over information that could determine not just Torres's fate, but the exposure of some of the most sensitive operations in modern military history. The simple charge of abandoning his post had become the catalyst for a confrontation between conventional military justice and the shadowy world of special access programs where normal rules and procedures did not apply. As Bennett struggled to regain control of his courtroom, it became clear that the proceedings had moved far beyond his ability to manage. The forces that Torres had unleashed through his decision to speak would require resolution at levels of command that transcended the authority of a single military judge, no matter how experienced or determined he might be. The tension in the courtroom had reached a fever pitch as various factions struggled for control over proceedings that had spiraled far beyond anyone's expectations. Judge Bennett gripped his gavel with white knuckles, his authority challenged by forces he neither understood nor controlled. General Stone maintained her position near the bar, her presence serving as a silent reminder that the simple military court was now operating in waters far deeper than its usual jurisdiction. Colonel Harrison shuffled through his case files with growing desperation, realizing that months of careful preparation might be rendered meaningless by information he had never been allowed to access. Torres stood motionless at the defense table, his decision to break operational security having set in motion events that would reverberate through the highest levels of military command. The burn scar on his neck seemed to pulse with the increased blood flow that accompanied his elevated heart rate, but his external composure remained unshakable. He had spent 6 months protecting secrets that he believed were more important than his own freedom, but the time for silence had finally passed. The gallery had filled with additional personnel during the exchanges between Bennett and General Stone, creating an audience that included some of the most senior intelligence and special operations figures in the military. Their presence transformed the courtroom from a routine legal proceeding into something resembling a high-level security briefing, with implications that extended far beyond the fate of a single sergeant. Secure communication devices buzzed quietly as observers reported developments to their respective commands, ensuring that the unfolding situation was being monitored at the highest levels of government. Captain Williams watched the proceedings with a mixture of amazement and growing understanding as pieces of a puzzle that had frustrated her for months finally began to fall into place. Her client's refusal to cooperate with his own defense, his insistence that some secrets were better left buried, and his apparent willingness to accept conviction rather than reveal classified information, all made sense in the context of special access programs. She realized that she had been attempting to defend a man whose true service record was so highly classified that even she lacked the security clearance necessary to understand the full scope of his accomplishments. Dr. Rodriguez, the military psychologist whose testimony had portrayed Torres as suffering from combat stress and decision paralysis, found herself questioning every aspect of her evaluation as she observed the composed and authoritative figure standing before the court. The man she was witnessing bore no resemblance to the psychologically damaged soldier she had described in her testimony. His bearing suggested someone who had operated at the highest levels of military professionalism, making life-and-death decisions in circumstances that few people could even imagine. Bennett's voice cracked slightly as he attempted to reassert control over his courtroom, the strain of the situation evident in his increasingly erratic behavior. His reputation for running efficient proceedings was crumbling as the case transformed into something far beyond his experience and expertise.
The presence of so many senior officers and intelligence operatives suggested that his handling of the situation was being scrutinized by people who possessed the authority to end his career with a single phone call. "This court will come to order immediately," Bennett declared, his voice carrying a note of desperation that undermined his attempted authority. "General Stone, I appreciate your concerns, but this tribunal operates under established legal procedures that cannot be suspended simply because classified information may be involved. Sergeant Torres will face judgment based on the evidence properly presented to this court." Stone's response was measured but carried an undertone of steel that made clear her determination to protect the operator standing before the bench. Her decades of experience in bureaucratic warfare had taught her exactly how to apply pressure when conventional channels proved inadequate. She understood that Torres had reached the point where his only options were revelation or conviction, and she was prepared to provide him with the authorization necessary to defend himself. "Your Honor, I believe you may be operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of the classification levels involved in this case. Sergeant Torres has been bound by security restrictions that supersede normal disclosure requirements in military legal proceedings. I am prepared to authorize the declassification of specific operational details that are material to his defense." The implications of Stone's offer sent ripples of tension through the courtroom as the various observers recognized the significance of what was being proposed. Declassification of special access program information was an extraordinary step that required authorization from the highest levels of government. The fact that Stone was prepared to take such action suggested that Torres's situation involved matters of national security that transcended the routine administration of military justice. Torres himself seemed to understand that he had reached a point of no return. His months of silence had been motivated by a desire to protect ongoing operations and the safety of personnel whose lives depended on maintaining operational security. But the prospect of conviction for cowardice and abandonment of duty had forced him to confront the reality that his sacrifice might serve no purpose if it resulted in the destruction of his reputation and the discrediting of the principles he had spent his career defending. Harrison's objections grew increasingly frantic as he realized that his carefully constructed prosecution was being undermined by information that had been deliberately withheld from the proceedings. His reputation as a thorough and prepared attorney was being destroyed by circumstances beyond his control, creating the possibility that his conviction of Torres might be overturned on appeal due to the prosecution's failure to disclose exculpatory evidence. "Your Honor, the prosecution objects in the strongest possible terms to this transparent attempt to introduce classified information after the close of evidence. The defendant has had months to request proper declassification procedures if such information was relevant to his defense. This last-minute revelation appears to be nothing more than a desperate attempt to create reasonable doubt through surprise and confusion." Williams rose to counter Harrison's objection, her confidence growing as she finally understood the true nature of her client's situation. The months of frustration and inadequate preparation had been the result of classification restrictions that had prevented her from accessing information crucial to Torres's defense. If Stone was prepared to authorize declassification, it would finally allow her to present the complete picture that she had been seeking since the beginning of the case. "Your Honor, the defense has repeatedly requested access to Sergeant Torres's complete service record and has been denied at every turn due to classification restrictions. If General Stone is prepared to provide the authorization necessary for full disclosure, the defense welcomes the opportunity to present evidence that has been improperly withheld from these proceedings." The courtroom had become a pressure cooker of competing interests and escalating tensions as the various factions positioned themselves for what was clearly becoming a battle over information that could determine not just Torres's fate, but the exposure of some of the most sensitive operations in modern military history. The intelligence operatives in the gallery maintained their careful watch, their presence serving as a reminder that the proceedings were being monitored by agencies whose interests extended far beyond conventional military justice. Bennett found himself increasingly isolated as the forces converging on his courtroom exceeded his ability to control or understand. His judicial authority was being challenged by classification systems and special access programs that operated under rules he had never encountered in his career. The prospect of making a decision that might inadvertently compromise national security created pressures that he was neither trained nor equipped to handle. The breaking point came when Torres stepped forward and addressed the court with a voice that carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to operating in the shadows where conventional rules did not apply. His decision to speak had set in motion events that could not be reversed, and he seemed to understand that his only option was to trust in the system that had trained him and the superiors who had sent him into harm's way. Your Honor, I request permission to provide my complete identification for the record, including operational designations that have been classified under special access programs. I believe this information is material to the charges against me and necessary for this court to render a just verdict. Stone nodded her approval, a gesture that provided Torres with the authorization he needed to break years of operational security and reveal information that had been protected at the highest levels of classification. Her presence in the courtroom represented more than moral support. It was official sanction for the disclosure of information that could fundamentally alter the understanding of what had occurred in Prague. Bennett's face had gone ashen as he grasped the magnitude of the situation developing before him. The routine military court that he had expected to conclude with a straightforward conviction had transformed into something that threatened to expose him to scrutiny from levels of government that he preferred to avoid. His reputation for efficiency and order was dissolving as forces beyond his comprehension took control of the proceedings. Sergeant Torres, this court is not equipped to handle classified briefings or special access program information. If such material is relevant to your defense, proper channels exist for its introduction through appropriate security procedures. I will not allow this tribunal to be manipulated by dramatic revelations that should have been disclosed through established protocols. Torres remained standing, his bearing now fully revealing the professional operator that he had kept hidden throughout months of legal proceedings. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable to those trained to recognize the difference between conventional soldiers and personnel who had operated in the most classified and dangerous missions of the modern military. Your Honor, with respect, the proper channels you reference have been utilized. However, the nature of my actual assignments has required maintaining operational security that has prevented full disclosure of relevant information. I am now prepared to waive those restrictions and provide this court with the complete context necessary to understand my actions in Prague. General Stone stepped forward again, her authority now dominating the courtroom despite the formal hierarchy that placed Bennett in the position of ultimate authority. Her decades of experience in protecting operators and managing classified information had prepared her for exactly this type of situation where conventional legal procedures collided with the requirements of national security. Your Honor, I formally authorize the declassification of Sergeant Torres's operational designation and mission parameters for Operation Thunderstrike. This information is material to his defense and necessary for the proper administration of justice in this case. The authorization from Stone sent shockwaves through the courtroom as the various observers recognized the extraordinary nature of what was being proposed. Declassification of operational information from special access programs was virtually unprecedented in military legal proceedings, requiring authorization from the highest levels of government and representing a fundamental shift in the balance between operational security and legal transparency. Harrison's voice reached a note of desperation as he realized that his prosecution was being undermined by forces completely beyond his control. His reputation as a thorough and prepared attorney was being destroyed by the revelation that crucial information had been withheld from the proceedings, creating the possibility that his conviction might be overturned on appeal due to prosecutorial misconduct. Your Honor, the prosecution demands a recess to review any classified information before it is introduced into evidence. The government's right to prepare an adequate response cannot be compromised by surprise revelations regardless of their classification level. This entire proceeding has been compromised by the defendant's failure to disclose relevant information through proper channels. Williams countered immediately, her frustration with months of procedural obstacles finally finding an outlet as she recognized that her client was finally prepared to defend himself with the truth. Her inability to mount an effective defense had been the direct result of classification restrictions that had prevented her from accessing information crucial to understanding Torres's actions. Your Honor, the defense objects to any further delays in these proceedings. Sergeant Torres has been bound by classification restrictions that have prevented him from defending himself adequately. If General Stone has authorized declassification, this court should hear the evidence immediately rather than allowing further procedural obstacles to prevent prevent the disclosure of exculpatory information. The tension in the courtroom reached an almost unbearable level as the various factions struggled for control over proceedings that had spiraled far beyond anyone's ability to predict or manage. The simple charge of abandoning his post had become the catalyst for a confrontation between conventional military justice and the shadowy world of special access programs where different rules applied and normal procedures were inadequate to address the complexities involved. Torres himself stood at the center of the storm with remarkable composure, understanding that his decision to break operational security would have consequences that extended far beyond his own fate. The men and women who had served alongside him in missions that could never be officially acknowledged deserved better than to see their sacrifices dismissed as cowardice and failure. His willingness to risk everything to tell the truth represented more than self-defense. It was a matter of honor and justice for all those who had served in the shadows. The moment of truth arrived when Bennett, faced with pressures from multiple directions and authority figures whose power exceeded his own, finally relented and allowed Torres to speak. His decision was motivated more by fear of the consequences of refusing than by any desire to pursue justice, but it nevertheless opened the door for revelations that would transform the understanding of everything that had occurred. Sergeant Torres, Bennett said, his voice barely above a whisper, "You may provide your complete identification for the record. However, this court reserves the right to classify any portion of these proceedings that may compromise national security." Torres stepped forward to the microphone positioned before the bench, his movements precise and controlled despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. The burn scar on his neck caught the harsh courtroom lighting, serving as a visible reminder of sacrifices made in service to missions that could never be publicly acknowledged or honored. For a moment he stood silently, gathering himself for the revelation that would change everything. General Stone nodded encouragingly from her position near the bar, providing him with the final authorization he needed to break years of operational security and reveal the truth about who he really was and what had actually happened in Prague. When Torres finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had operated at the highest levels of military professionalism, making life and death decisions in circumstances that few people could even imagine. The words he was about to utter would not only vindicate his actions but expose a level of service and sacrifice that transcended anything the court had been prepared to consider. "For the record," Torres said, his voice steady and clear, "my operational designation during the period in question was Ghost Rider, assigned to Task Force Nightfall 6 under the direct authority of Joint Special Operations Command. My actual mission in Prague was not hostage rescue but the termination of a high-value target whose elimination was deemed critical to national security." The reaction to Torres's revelation was instantaneous and electric. A colonel in the third row dropped his pen, the metallic sound echoing through the sudden silence like a gunshot. The intelligence operative who had been taking careful notes throughout the proceedings stood abruptly, her hand moving instinctively toward the secure communication device on her belt. General Stone's composed expression remained unchanged, but those who knew her well could detect a slight relaxation in her shoulders that indicated
relief at Torres finally being able to tell his story. Judge Bennett's face went through a series of rapid transformations as the implications of what he had just heard began to register. The color drained from his cheeks as he realized that the routine court-martial he had been presiding over was actually the prosecution of one of the military's most elite operators. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the water glass on his bench, understanding that his career might very well hang in the balance depending on how he handled the next few minutes. Colonel Harrison sat frozen at the prosecution table, his carefully organized case files suddenly rendered meaningless by information that fundamentally altered every assumption upon which his prosecution had been built. The confident demeanor that had carried him through 3 days of testimony evaporated as he grasped the magnitude of his error. Prosecuting a special operations legend for cowardice was the kind of career-ending mistake that would follow him for the rest of his professional life. Captain Williams felt a surge of vindication mixed with anger as she finally understood why her client had refused to cooperate with his own defense. Torres had been protecting information so sensitive that its disclosure could compromise ongoing operations and endanger the lives of operators still in the field. His willingness to accept conviction for cowardice rather than break operational security represented a level of honor and dedication that transcended personal considerations. The courtroom had erupted into controlled chaos as senior officers throughout the gallery began speaking urgently into secure phones, reporting the development to their respective commands. The presence of so many high-ranking officials suddenly made sense as Torres's true identity explained why his case had drawn attention from the highest levels of military leadership. Ghost Rider was not merely a call sign, it was a legend within the special operations community. Dr. Rodriguez, the military psychologist who had testified about Torres's supposed psychological damage, stared at the man standing before the microphone with growing horror as she realized the extent of her misunderstanding. Her evaluation had been based on conventional psychological models that were completely inadequate for assessing someone who had operated at Torres's level. The symptoms she had interpreted as combat stress and decision paralysis were actually the carefully controlled responses of someone trained to compartmentalize information and maintain operational security under extreme pressure. Torres continued his testimony with the precise clinical tone of someone delivering an operational briefing to cleared personnel. The transformation from defeated defendant to professional operator was complete, revealing the man that had been hidden beneath months of enforced silence and misdirection. The target was identified through signals intelligence as the primary coordinator for a series of terrorist attacks targeting American interests in Eastern Europe. His elimination was authorized at the highest levels after conventional diplomatic and law enforcement efforts proved inadequate. The hostage rescue operation served as cover for my insertion into the target area and provided plausible justification for the presence of American military personnel in a location where we had no official authorization to operate. Each word fell like a hammer blow on Harrison's prosecution as the carefully constructed narrative of cowardice and abandonment crumbled under the weight of classified reality. The prosecutor's face had gone pale as he realized that every piece of evidence he had presented to the court had been taken out of context, creating a completely false impression of what had actually occurred in Prague. General Stone stepped forward to provide additional context, her authorization allowing for the disclosure of information that had been protected for national security reasons. Her presence in the courtroom represented more than moral support for Torres. It was official recognition that his actions had been not only authorized but essential to American security interests. Ghost Rider's mission parameters required him to maintain his cover identity as a conventional Special Forces operator while executing a targeted elimination that could not be officially acknowledged. His abandonment of his assigned position during the hostage rescue was actually the execution of his primary mission, which took precedence over all other considerations including the cover operation. The revelation continued to unfold as Torres provided additional details about the complexity of the operation and the split-second decision-making that had been required when the situation in Prague developed beyond the original mission parameters. His apparent abandonment of his post had actually been a tactical movement to engage the high-value target who had attempted to escape during the chaos of the hostage rescue. The target attempted to flee through a secondary exit that was not covered by the rescue team's deployment. My movement from the assigned perimeter position was necessary to intercept him before he could escape into the urban environment where subsequent apprehension would have been impossible. The mission required maintaining the appearance of a failed rescue operation to protect the classified nature of the actual objective. Judge Bennett struggled to process the information being revealed in his courtroom, his limited experience with classified operations leaving him completely unprepared for the complexities involved in special access programs. The simple case of military misconduct that he had expected to resolve with a routine conviction had transformed into something that exposed him to scrutiny from levels of government that possessed the authority to end his career with a single decision. Williams rose to address the court with renewed confidence, finally able to present the defense that she had been seeking to mount for months. The classification restrictions that had prevented her from accessing Torres's complete service record had left her fighting with one hand tied behind her back, but the declassification authorized by General Stone finally allowed her to advocate effectively for her client. Your Honor, this revelation fundamentally alters every aspect of the prosecution's case. Sergeant Torres was not abandoning his duty, he was executing classified orders that took precedence over the cover operation. His silence during these proceedings was not an admission of guilt but a demonstration of the operational security discipline that is essential to special operations success.
The implications of Torres's testimony extended far beyond his individual case as the various observers in the courtroom began to understand the broader context of what they were witnessing. The prosecution of Ghostwriter for cowardice represented a fundamental failure of the system to protect operators who were carrying out the most sensitive and dangerous missions in the American arsenal. The potential for similar misunderstandings in the future raised questions about the adequacy of existing procedures for protecting classified personnel from prosecution based on incomplete information. Harrison attempted to salvage his prosecution by questioning the timing of Torres's revelation, but his objections fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence that classification restrictions had prevented the disclosure of exculpatory information. His reputation as a thorough and prepared prosecutor was in ruins, destroyed by forces beyond his control and understanding. Your Honor, the prosecution maintains that if this information was relevant to the defendant's case, proper procedures existed for its disclosure through appropriate security channels. The timing of this revelation suggests a calculated attempt to manipulate the proceedings after the close of evidence. Stone's response was swift and devastating, her decades of experience in protecting classified operations providing her with the authority to expose the flaws in Harrison's argument. Her presence in the courtroom represented the full weight of the special operations community, making clear that Torres's treatment was being monitored at the highest levels of military leadership. Colonel Harrison, the security procedures you reference are designed to protect ongoing operations and personnel who remain in classified assignments. Sergeant Torres has maintained operational security throughout these proceedings at considerable personal cost. His willingness to break that security now represents an extraordinary sacrifice made necessary by this court's failure to understand the classified nature of his service. The courtroom had become the site of a historic moment as the collision between conventional military justice and special operations reality played out before an audience of senior officials who understood the broader implications of what was occurring. Torres's case would likely become a precedent for how classified personnel were protected from prosecution based on incomplete information, ensuring that future operators would not face similar situations. Torres himself continued to provide details about his service record and the specific circumstances that had led to his assignment to Ghostwriter status within Task Force Nightfall 6. His testimony revealed a level of training and experience that far exceeded anything suggested by his official personnel file, explaining the disconnect between his apparent qualifications and the complex nature of the mission he had been assigned. My selection for special access programs was based on psychological evaluations that indicated an ability to operate independently under extreme stress while maintaining compartmentalized information security. The training regimen included advanced combat skills, intelligence analysis, and deep cover techniques that prepared me for operations where conventional support structures were not available. Dr. Rodriguez listened to Torres's description of his actual background with growing understanding of how completely she had misinterpreted his psychological profile. The characteristics she had identified as symptoms of combat stress were actually the carefully developed coping mechanisms of someone trained to process extreme experiences without allowing them to interfere with operational effectiveness. Her testimony characterizing him as psychologically damaged would need to be completely retracted in light of the new information. Bennett found himself in an impossible position as the proceedings continued to spiral beyond his ability to control or understand. His judicial authority was being challenged by classification systems and special access programs that operated under rules he had never encountered in his career. The prospect of making decisions that might inadvertently compromise national security created pressures that exceeded his training and experience. The turning point came when Torres provided specific details about the high-value target he had been assigned to eliminate and the intelligence that had led to the mission authorization. The information revealed the scope of the terrorist threat that had necessitated the operation and the potential consequences if the target had been allowed to escape. The subject was identified as the operational commander for a network planning simultaneous attacks on American embassies in 3 European capitals. Signals intelligence indicated that the attacks were scheduled to occur within 72 hours of our insertion into Prague. Conventional diplomatic efforts had failed to secure cooperation from local authorities, making direct action the only viable option for preventing the attacks.
The revelation of the stakes involved in Torres's mission sent shockwaves through the courtroom as the various observers grasped the magnitude of what he had accomplished while maintaining his cover as a conventional special forces operator. The lives saved by his successful elimination of the target far exceeded the tragic loss that had occurred during the hostage rescue, but the classified nature of his actual mission had prevented this context from being considered during his prosecution. General Stone provided additional confirmation of Torres's account, her authorization allowing for the disclosure of intelligence assessments that had led to the mission approval. Her testimony revealed the extensive planning and coordination that had gone into the operation, demonstrating that Torres's actions had been far from the impulsive abandonment of duty that Harrison had characterized. Ghost Rider's mission was approved by a joint intelligence committee after extensive analysis of the threat posed by the target. The cover operation was designed to provide plausible justification for American military presence while allowing for the execution of a mission that could not be officially acknowledged. Sergeant Torres performed exactly as trained and as ordered, preventing attacks that would have resulted in significant American casualties. Williams moved to have all charges against Torres dismissed in light of the overwhelming evidence that his actions had been not only authorized but essential to national security. Her motion was supported by testimony from the highest levels of military command, making clear that Torres's prosecution had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of his actual mission and service record. Your Honor, the evidence presented to this court demonstrates conclusively that Sergeant Torres was executing classified orders when he moved from his assigned position during Operation Thunderstrike. His actions prevented a terrorist attack that would have cost American lives, and his subsequent silence was motivated by operational security requirements rather than any admission of guilt. Harrison's final attempt to maintain his prosecution was met with stony silence from the gallery and visible disapproval from General Stone, whose presence had transformed the proceedings from a routine court-martial into a referendum on the military's treatment of its most elite operators. His reputation as a prosecutor was in ruins, destroyed by his failure to understand the classified nature of the case he had been assigned to prosecute. Judge Bennett faced the inevitable conclusion that his court had been operating under incomplete information that had led to the prosecution of one of the military's most decorated operators, for actions that had actually prevented a major terrorist attack. His decision to dismiss all charges against Torres was motivated as much by self-preservation as by justice, but it nevertheless represented the correct resolution of a case that should never have reached trial. In light of the classified information presented to this court, all charges against Staff Sergeant Michael Torres are hereby dismissed. This court acknowledges that the defendant's actions during Operation Thunderstrike were consistent with his authorized mission parameters, and in service to the national security interests of the United States. The dismissal of charges represented more than vindication for Torres. It was recognition of the sacrifices made by all operators who served in classified capacities where their true contributions could never be publicly acknowledged or honored. His willingness to break operational security rather than accept conviction for cowardice had exposed systematic flaws in how the military protected its most sensitive personnel from prosecution based on incomplete information. Torres accepted the court's apology with the same quiet dignity he had maintained throughout the proceedings, understanding that his vindication came at the cost of exposing information that he had spent his career protecting. His sacrifice had been necessary to prevent a miscarriage of justice, but it also served to highlight the need for better procedures to protect classified personnel from similar situations in the future. General Stone approached Torres after the formal conclusion of the proceedings, her expression reflecting both relief at his vindication and concern for the operational security that had been compromised by the necessity of his defense. Her presence throughout the trial had been motivated by a determination to protect one of her most valuable operators from a system that had failed to understand his true service and sacrifice. Ghost Rider, your willingness to break operational security to defend your honor reflects the same courage that made you an outstanding operator. The special operations community owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid. Torres's response reflected the humility and professionalism that had characterized his entire career, even in the face of prosecution for actions that had actually saved American lives. His understanding of the larger implications of his case extended beyond personal vindication to encompass the need for systemic changes that would protect future operators from similar misunderstandings. General, the mission always comes first. If my case can prevent other operators from facing prosecution based on incomplete information, then the compromise of operational security was worth the cost. As the courtroom cleared and the various officials departed to brief their respective commands on the outcome of the proceedings, Torres stood alone with Captain Williams, finally able to thank her for her efforts on his behalf despite the classification restrictions that had prevented her from mounting an effective defense. "Captain, your willingness to fight for me even when you didn't understand the full picture demonstrates the kind of dedication that makes the military justice system work when it's properly supported. Thank you for believing in me when the evidence suggested otherwise." Williams' response reflected her own growth through the experience of representing a client whose true service record had been hidden from her by classification requirements. Her understanding of the complexities involved in protecting classified personnel would influence her approach to future cases involving special operations personnel. "Sergeant Torres, your case has taught me that sometimes the most important evidence is the evidence we can't see. I'll never again assume that a client's official record tells the complete story of their service and sacrifice." The legacy of Torres's case extended far beyond his individual vindication as the military began implementing new procedures to protect classified personnel from prosecution based on incomplete information. His willingness to sacrifice operational security rather than accept conviction for cowardice had exposed flaws in the system that needed to be addressed to ensure that future operators would not face similar situations. Judge Bennett submitted his resignation immediately following the conclusion of the proceedings, understanding that his handling of the case had exposed him to criticism from levels of command that possessed the authority to end his career. His failure to recognize the classified nature of Torres's service had nearly resulted in the conviction of one of the military's most elite operators for actions that had actually prevented a terrorist attack. Colonel Harrison faced an intensive review of his prosecution methods and was ultimately reassigned to a position where his access to classified cases would be limited. His failure to understand the broader context of Torres's case had damaged his reputation as a thorough and prepared prosecutor, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of proceeding without complete information. Dr. Rodriguez submitted a revised psychological evaluation that acknowledged her misunderstanding of Torres's actual background and training. Her testimony serving as an example of how conventional psychological models were inadequate for assessing personnel who had operated at the highest levels of classification. Her experience with Torres's case led to the development of new evaluation protocols specifically designed for special operations personnel. The intelligence operatives who had monitored the proceedings returned to their respective agencies with recommendations for improved coordination between operational and legal communities to prevent similar misunderstandings in the future. Torres's case became a study in how classification requirements could conflict with legal proceedings, leading to the development of new procedures for protecting both operational security and individual rights. Torres himself returned to active duty with a new assignment that reflected both his vindication and the recognition of his exceptional service record. His experience had demonstrated the importance of protecting operators who served in classified capacities, leading to systematic changes in how the military handled legal proceedings involving Special Access Program personnel. The burn scar on his neck would always serve as a reminder of the sacrifices he had made in service to missions that could never be publicly acknowledged. But his willingness to break operational security to defend his honor had also protected future operators from facing similar prosecutions based on incomplete information. His legacy extended far beyond his individual vindication to encompass reforms that would benefit the entire special operations community. The reverberations from Torres's vindication spread through the Pentagon like ripples across a still pond, reaching offices and departments that most military personnel never knew existed. Within hours of the court-martial's conclusion, secure communications channels buzzed with traffic as various agencies grappled with the implications of what had transpired at Fort Campbell. The case had exposed fundamental weaknesses in how the military protected its most sensitive assets, forcing a comprehensive review of procedures that had been considered adequate for decades. Secretary of Defense Margaret Hartwell received her briefing on the Torres case while en route to a NATO summit in Brussels, her aide delivering the classified summary through encrypted channels that ensured complete privacy. Her reaction was swift and decisive, recognizing that the near conviction of one of America's most elite operators represented a systemic failure that demanded immediate attention from the highest levels of government. The potential for similar cases to emerge from the shadows where special operations personnel carried out their most sensitive missions created national security implications that transcended any single individual's career or reputation. The Joint Chiefs of Staff convened an emergency session within 24 hours of Torres's exoneration. Their deliberations focused on preventing future occurrences of what was already being referred to internally as the Ghost Rider incident. General Stone found herself at the center of these discussions, her decision to authorize declassification having saved Torres from conviction while simultaneously exposing the inadequacy of existing protections for classified personnel. Her reputation as a fierce advocate for operators had been enhanced by her willingness to challenge the system when it threatened one of her people. Torres himself reported to General Stone's office at Joint Special Operations Command Headquarters 48 hours after his vindication. The weight of months of uncertainty finally lifted from his shoulders. The sparse decorations and functional furniture reflected the no-nonsense efficiency that characterized Special Operations leadership, but the presence of several other senior officers suggested that his debriefing would involve more than routine administrative procedures. His experience had become a case study in the vulnerabilities of the current system, requiring detailed analysis to prevent similar situations from developing in the future. Stone's opening remarks set the tone for what would prove to be an extensive examination of how classification requirements could conflict with legal protections in ways that threatened both operational security and individual justice. Her concern extended beyond Torres's specific situation to encompass the broader implications for all personnel operating under special access programs whose true service records were hidden behind layers of classification that conventional legal proceedings could not penetrate. Ghost Rider, your case has forced us to confront some uncomfortable realities about how we protect our people when they're operating in the gray areas where conventional rules don't apply. The fact that you came within days of conviction for actions that actually prevented a major terrorist attack demonstrates that our current procedures are inadequate to protect classified personnel from prosecution based on incomplete information. Torres's response reflected the analytical mindset that had made him effective in special operations, his ability to compartmentalize personal considerations while focusing on broader systemic issues. His experience had provided him with unique insights into the vulnerabilities that existed within the military justice system when it encountered operations that existed outside normal classification boundaries. General, my case was probably inevitable given the increasing complexity of special access programs and the growing number of operators working under deep cover identities. The classification restrictions that protect ongoing operations can become a trap for personnel who find themselves facing legal proceedings based on their cover identities rather than their actual service records. The discussion continued for several hours as Torres provided detailed analysis of how his case had developed and what systemic changes might prevent similar situations from arising in the future. His recommendations focused on creating better coordination between operational and legal communities, ensuring that classified personnel facing legal proceedings would have access to advocates who possess the necessary security clearances to understand the full scope of their service. Meanwhile, at Fort Campbell, the aftermath of the court-martial continued to generate shockwaves throughout the military legal community as attorneys and judges grappled with the implications of the Torres case for their own practices. Captain Williams found herself inundated with requests for interviews and consultations from colleagues seeking to understand how classification issues might affect their own cases involving special operations personnel. Her experience defending a client whose true service record had been hidden from her by security restrictions had provided her with insights that were rapidly becoming essential knowledge for military attorneys. The case had also attracted attention from academic institutions and think tanks specializing in military justice issues. Their interest focused on the broader implications of classification systems that could prevent effective legal representation. Professor Elizabeth Chen at the Military Justice Institute had already begun incorporating the Torres case into her curriculum, recognizing that future military attorneys would need to understand the complexities involved in representing classified personnel. Judge Bennett's resignation had been accepted with unusual speed, his departure from the military justice system serving as a clear signal that the handling of classified cases required expertise and sensitivity that exceeded conventional judicial training. His replacement would be selected specifically for experience with special operations cases, ensuring that future
proceedings involving classified personnel would be conducted by judges who understood the unique challenges involved in balancing operational security with legal transparency. Colonel Harrison's career had been effectively terminated by his role in prosecuting Torres, his failure to recognize the classified nature of the case marking him as someone who lacked the judgment necessary for handling sensitive legal matters. His reassignment to an administrative position represented more than professional discipline. It served as a warning to other prosecutors about the importance of understanding the full context of their cases before pursuing convictions that might later prove to be based on incomplete information. Dr. Rodriguez had used her experience with Torres to develop new psychological evaluation protocols specifically designed for special operations personnel. Her recognition of the inadequacy of conventional assessment methods leading to improvements that would benefit future operators. Her revised understanding of how elite personnel processed extreme experiences had contributed to better support systems for operators transitioning between classified and conventional assignments. The intelligence community had responded to the Torres case by implementing new procedures for coordinating with military legal authorities when classified personnel faced legal proceedings. The near conviction of one of their most valuable assets had demonstrated the need for better communication between operational and legal communities, leading to the establishment of liaison positions specifically designed to prevent similar misunderstandings from occurring in the future. Torres's new assignment reflected both his vindication and the recognition that his experience had made him uniquely qualified to help address the systemic issues his case had exposed. His position as liaison between Special Operations Command and the military justice system would allow him to help other classified personnel who might find themselves facing similar situations, ensuring that future operators would have access to the advocacy and support that had nearly been denied to him. The broader Special Operations community had rallied around Torres during his ordeal, their support reflecting the understanding that his prosecution represented a threat to all personnel operating under classified cover identities. His vindication had been celebrated not just as individual justice but as validation of the sacrifices made by all operators who served in missions that could never be publicly acknowledged or honored. The brotherhood that bound special operations personnel together had proven stronger than the bureaucratic forces that had threatened to destroy one of their own. The families of the operators who had served alongside Torres in Task Force Nightfall 6 received notification of his vindication through secure channels, their relief reflecting the understanding that his conviction would have called into question the honor and service of all personnel associated with the unit. His willingness to break operational security rather than accept conviction for cowardice had protected not just his own reputation but the legacy of all those who had served with him in missions that remained classified. Congressional oversight committees had taken notice of the Torres case, their interest focused on ensuring that legislative protections existed for classified personnel facing legal proceedings based on incomplete information. Representative Sarah Martinez, who chaired the House Subcommittee on Military Personnel, had already announced hearings designed to examine whether additional statutory protections were needed to prevent future cases of classified personnel being prosecuted without access to their complete service records. The media attention surrounding Torres's case had been carefully managed to protect operational security while acknowledging the broader implications of his vindication for military justice. The official statements released by the Pentagon had focused on the importance of protecting classified personnel from prosecution based on incomplete information, while avoiding any specific details that might compromise ongoing operations or personnel still serving under classified cover identities. International allies who had participated in joint operations with Task Force Nightfall 6 received briefings on the outcome of Torres's case through diplomatic channels, their governments expressing relief that one of their most trusted American partners had been vindicated after facing prosecution for actions that had actually saved lives. The case had potential implications for future intelligence sharing and joint operations, making its resolution a matter of international as well as domestic significance. Torres's burn scar had faded somewhat during the months of legal proceedings, but it remained a visible reminder of the sacrifices he had made in service to missions that most people would never know had occurred. His willingness to bear that mark without explanation or complaint had demonstrated the kind of quiet professionalism that characterized the best special operations personnel, their dedication to mission accomplishment transcending personal considerations. The psychological impact of his ordeal had been significant but manageable, his training in compartmentalization and stress management having prepared him for the kind of sustained pressure that would have broken most people. His ability to maintain operational security while facing conviction for cowardice had demonstrated the effectiveness of the psychological conditioning that was an essential component of special operations training. The financial costs of his defense had been substantial, but Captain Williams had waived most of her fees in recognition of the importance of the case and the classification restrictions that had prevented her from mounting an effective defense until the final stages of the proceedings. Her pro bono work on behalf of Torres had enhanced her reputation within the military legal community while providing her with expertise in classified cases that would prove valuable throughout her career. The technological aspects of Torres's case had highlighted the need for better information systems that could provide cleared legal personnel with access to classified service records without compromising operational security. The development of new database systems specifically designed to support legal proceedings involving classified personnel had become a priority for military information technology specialists working to prevent future cases like Torres's from occurring. Training programs for military attorneys had been revised to include instruction on the special considerations involved in representing classified personnel, ensuring that future defenders would understand the unique challenges and opportunities involved in such cases. The Torres case had become a standard component of these curricula, providing concrete examples of how classification issues could affect legal proceedings and how they might be addressed. The precedent established by Torres's vindication had already been cited in several other cases involving special operations personnel facing legal proceedings. His willingness to break operational security having created a pathway for other classified personnel to defend themselves when necessary. The balance between operational security and legal rights remained delicate, but his case had demonstrated that protection of both interests was possible when proper procedures were followed. Professional associations representing military attorneys had developed new ethical guidelines specifically addressing the representation of classified personnel, recognizing that conventional legal ethics might be inadequate when dealing with clients whose true service records were hidden behind security restrictions. These guidelines emphasized the importance of understanding the full scope of a client's background while respecting the legitimate requirements of operational security. The academic study of military justice had been enriched by the Torres case, with law schools and military academies incorporating his experience into their curricula as an example of how classification systems could interact with legal proceedings in unexpected ways. His case had become a touchstone for discussions about the balance between national security and individual rights in an era of increasingly complex special operations. Torres's relationship with his family had been strengthened by his vindication, their faith in his honor having been validated by the revelation of his true service record. His decision to protect operational security rather than defend himself had demonstrated the kind of selfless dedication that they had always known characterized his military service, even when they couldn't understand the specific details of his assignments. The burn scar on his neck had become a source of pride rather than shame, its presence serving as a reminder of his willingness to sacrifice everything in service to missions that could never be publicly acknowledged. His colleagues in the special operations community understood its significance even when they couldn't discuss the specific circumstances that had caused it, their respect for his service transcending the need for detailed explanation. The legacy of Torres's case extended far beyond his individual vindication to encompass fundamental changes in how the military protected its most sensitive personnel from prosecution based on incomplete information. His willingness to break operational security rather than accept conviction for cowardice had exposed systematic flaws that needed to be addressed to ensure that future operators would not face similar situations. The reforms implemented in response to his case had created new protections for classified personnel while maintaining the security requirements that were essential to operational success. The balance between these competing interests would always be delicate, but Torres's experience had demonstrated that both objectives could be achieved when proper procedures were followed and adequate resources were devoted to protecting the rights of personnel who served in the shadows. His new role as liaison between Special Operations Command and the military justice system had allowed him to help other classified personnel facing similar challenges, ensuring that his hard-won expertise would benefit future operators who might find themselves caught between operational security and legal necessity. His willingness to serve in this capacity demonstrated the same dedication to mission accomplishment that had characterized his entire career. The respect he had earned throughout the special operations community had been enhanced by his handling of the legal challenge. His refusal to compromise operational security even when facing conviction for cowardice having demonstrated the kind of integrity that was essential to maintaining the trust necessary for classified operations. His vindication had validated not just his individual honor but the principles that guided all personnel who served in missions that existed beyond public acknowledgement. The quiet satisfaction he felt at his vindication was tempered by understanding that his case had exposed vulnerabilities that could have affected many other operators if they had not been addressed. His willingness to sacrifice his operational security to protect the system that had failed him demonstrated the kind of institutional loyalty that ensured the continued effectiveness of special operations forces in an increasingly complex operational environment. 5 years after his vindication, Staff Sergeant Michael Torres stood before a new generation of special operations personnel at the classified training facility in Bragg, North Carolina. The scar on his neck had continued to fade with time, but its presence still served as a tangible reminder of the sacrifices that came with operating in the shadows where conventional recognition was impossible. His role as instructor and advocate had evolved far beyond what anyone could have anticipated when he first broke his operational security in that Fort Campbell courtroom. The young operators seated before him represented the finest talent the military had to offer, each one handpicked for psychological resilience, technical expertise, and the kind of moral flexibility required for missions that existed in the gray areas between conventional warfare and intelligence operations. Their training would prepare them not just for the physical and mental challenges of special operations but for the unique legal and ethical complexities that Torres's case had revealed as critical vulnerabilities in the system. Torres began his briefing with the same clinical precision that had characterized his testimony during the court-martial, but his audience understood that they were receiving insights that had been purchased with blood and nearly cost him everything he had worked to achieve. His experience had become legendary within the special operations community, not just for his tactical accomplishments but for his willingness to sacrifice himself to protect the integrity of the system that had failed him. Your operational effectiveness depends not just on your ability to complete missions under extreme conditions but on your understanding of how those missions exist within a larger legal and political framework that may not always be equipped to protect you when things go wrong. The classification systems that protect our operations can also become traps when conventional legal procedures encounter situations they weren't designed to handle. The training curriculum that had evolved from Torres's experience addressed gaps in operator preparation that had been exposed by his near conviction for actions that had actually prevented a terrorist attack. Future operators needed to understand not just the tactical aspects of their missions but the legal and political context that could determine their fate if their activities ever came under scrutiny from authorities who lacked the security clearances necessary to understand their true purpose. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the new chief psychologist for Special Operations Training, had worked closely with Torres to develop evaluation protocols that would identify personnel capable of maintaining operational security under the kind of sustained legal pressure that he had endured. Her research had built upon the lessons learned from Dr. Rodriguez's misunderstanding of Torres's psychological profile, creating assessment tools that could distinguish between genuine psychological damage and the controlled responses that characterized elite operators.
The institutional changes that had emerged from Torres's case had fundamentally altered how the military approached the intersection of classified operations and legal proceedings. The creation of specialized legal advocate positions within each service branch ensured that classified personnel facing legal challenges would have access to attorneys who possessed both the necessary security clearances and the expertise to navigate the complex intersection of operational security and individual rights. Captain Williams, now promoted to major, had become the Army's first classified personnel legal advocate, her experience defending Torres having provided her with unique insights into the challenges involved in representing clients whose true service records were hidden behind security restrictions. Her new position represented more than career advancement. It was recognition that the military legal system needed specialists who could bridge the gap between operational and legal communities. The technology systems that supported these new legal protections had evolved significantly since Torres's case, with secure databases and communication protocols designed to allow cleared legal personnel access to classified service records without compromising ongoing operations. The development of these systems had required unprecedented cooperation between intelligence agencies and military legal authorities, creating new paradigms for information sharing that balanced security requirements with the demands of effective legal representation. General Stone had retired from active duty but continued to serve as a consultant on special operations policy, her advocacy for Torres having enhanced her reputation as someone willing to challenge the system when it threatened the welfare of operators under her command. Her influence on the reforms that followed his vindication ensured that future generations of special operations personnel would benefit from protections that she had fought to establish. The international implications of Torres's case had continued to resonate through allied intelligence communities, with NATO partners and other coalition allies implementing similar protections for their own classified personnel. The sharing of lessons learned from his experience had strengthened intelligence relationships while demonstrating America's commitment to protecting the operators who carried out the most sensitive joint missions. Torres's personal life had stabilized in ways that would have seemed impossible during the dark months of his court-martial. His marriage to Dr. Sarah Chen, a linguistics professor who had been cleared to understand the broad outlines of his service without compromising operational details, had provided him with the kind of stable foundation that many operators struggled to achieve. Their relationship demonstrated that it was possible to maintain meaningful personal connections even while serving in roles that required extensive compartmentalization and secrecy. The academic community had embraced Torres's case as a watershed moment in the study of military justice, with multiple universities offering courses specifically focused on the legal challenges faced by classified personnel. Professor Martinez at Georgetown Law School had published a definitive analysis of the case that had become required reading for military attorneys and had influenced policy discussions at the highest levels of government. Congressional oversight of special operations had been enhanced by the lessons learned from Torres's experience, with new reporting requirements designed to ensure that legislative authorities were aware of potential legal vulnerabilities faced by classified personnel. Representative Johnson, who had led the congressional investigation into the systemic failures exposed by the case, had become a fierce advocate for operator welfare and had sponsored legislation creating additional protections for special operations families. The financial compensation that Torres had received for his ordeal had been substantial, reflecting both the injustice he had suffered and the value of the lessons his experience had provided to the broader military community. However, he had donated most of the settlement to a foundation supporting the families of special operations personnel, his generosity reflecting the same selfless dedication that had characterized his military service. The psychological counseling services available to special operations personnel had been revolutionized by insights gained from Torres's case, with new programs designed to help operators process the unique stresses of serving in roles where their true contributions could never be publicly acknowledged. The understanding that conventional therapeutic approaches were inadequate for elite personnel had led to the development of specialized treatment protocols that respected the operational security requirements while providing effective mental health support. The training exercises that now incorporated scenarios based on Torres's experience had become among the most valuable components of special operations preparation. teaching operators how to maintain operational security while protecting their legal rights if they faced prosecution based on incomplete information. These simulations provided realistic practice in the kind of compartmentalization and strategic thinking that could mean the difference between conviction and vindication. The burn scar that had once served as a painful reminder of his ordeal had become a source of pride and connection to the community of operators who understood its significance. The young personnel who now learned from his experience would carry forward not just tactical knowledge but an understanding of the ethical and legal complexities that define modern special operations. Torres's legacy extended far beyond his individual vindication to encompass fundamental changes in how America protected its most valuable and vulnerable military assets. His willingness to sacrifice everything to defend his honor had exposed systemic weaknesses while demonstrating the kind of integrity that was essential to maintaining public trust in special operations capabilities. The quiet satisfaction he felt in his new role was enhanced by the knowledge that his ordeal had prevented countless other operators from facing similar challenges. The reforms that had emerged from his case had created a more just and effective system that better balanced the competing demands of operational security and individual rights. His story had become more than a cautionary tale. It was inspiration for all those who served in the shadows where heroism could never be publicly acknowledged. The understanding that honor and duty sometimes required sacrificing everything, including operational security, to defend principles that transcended individual considerations had become a core component of special operations ethos. The respect he commanded throughout the military extended far beyond the special operations community to encompass all those who understood that freedom and security depended on the willingness of exceptional individuals to serve in roles where recognition was impossible and failure could cost everything. His vindication had validated not just his personal honor but the principles that guided all who served in America's most sensitive and dangerous missions. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.